Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here. I echo and support most of what's been discussed today. I'm chagrined that it's taken this long to get us to this point. I just have a quick question, Mr. Norquist. How long will it take us to actually get a clean opinion and identify material weaknesses, deficiencies, significant deficiencies, et cetera? When will we get a clean opinion?
Senator, I don't know.
What's the range of expectation?
So the benchmark I use is the last assignment I had at Department of Homeland Security. It took them 10 years. The numbers of weaknesses came down steadily, so you could see the progress, but they were typically one or two at the end that took some time.
But it's your expectation that this year we'll have an estimate of the number of material weaknesses, deficiencies, significant deficiencies, et cetera, that the remediation you're talking about could take 10 years. But how long will it take us to determine what work we have to do to remediate?
You'll know the bulk of that this fall when the auditors finish their first audit, but I would anticipate that in the second year they'll be able to go deeper and may uncover more things. So I think over the first 2 years we'll see the vast majority of the findings that they will have.
So I'm just a dumb business guy, but the DoD is not that much bigger than our largest public corporations. And I just can't imagine Walmart calling the SEC or the IRS and saying, I'm sorry, the quarterly statements aren't going to be in this quarter. 10 years is outrageous. That's too long. We've got to find a way to close that down. There's no public corporation in the world that would be allowed by this federal government 10 years to remediate. It's just not, it wouldn't happen. It's not necessary. And I want us to address that in future conversation, Mr. Chairman. Second thing is, I want to talk about Congress. There's one very easy reason to explain why it's taking 28 years. Congress didn't do its job. It passed a law and then do anything to enforce it. And all the excuses that were used, from systems inadequacies to no chart of accounts, were just unacceptable and should never have been accepted. But that's water under the bridge. I want to talk about going forward. What have we learned? Senator Whitehouse talks about $1.7 trillion being spent. What the reality is, in the last decade, about a third, a little more than, just a little less than a third of what we've spent as a federal government has been borrowed money. That means in the next 10 years, the current forecast, if we continue to add debt the way we've added in the last 10 years and the way the current budget says we will over the next decade, about a third of what we spend will be borrowed. That, by definition, if the first dollar goes to mandatory expenses, which it does, that means that every dollar that we spend in discretionary spending, that's DoD, VA, and about $350 billion of total other discretionary domestic spending is all borrowed money. That means that every dime we spend in the DoD, we have to go to China and borrow. So we have these situations around the world, these bilateral agreements like Taiwan. To defend Taiwan against China, we have to go to to China and borrow the money to go to Taiwan and do that. This is how serious this is and how time sensitive. My question is, when we talk about procurement, and a lot of these contracting relationships are dealing with procurement, I believe that the procurement process and the CR impact, the CR reality of a broken budget process adds to it. When you do these audits, are you going to measure the impact of continuing resolutions on the procurement process and the $1 billion of waste that are found there, or to be found there?
So the audit itself does not directly do that, but what it allows us to do, because of the type of information we get out of the audit, is to drill down into exactly those types of questions, because you'll have the transaction level data that will let you look at the effect. And when you
I get that. So as I understand it, there's no common chart of accounts, so that'll take a while to develop that as well. And even the systems inadequacies that don't allow different parts of the DoD to talk to you is a hindrance. I get that, and that's part of the delay. We want to know if you run into those problems or obstacles. We need to know those on the front end.
Absolutely.
We've got to, 10 years is just too long to get there. I want to talk about the sequester and also the fundamental measurement of the effect of not having a capital budget. We don't have a capital budget, Mr. Gibson. I know you answered the question earlier about normal operation procurement. I get that, ongoing replenishment of ammunitions and supplies, et cetera, et cetera. But in these big ticket, we're going to spend $26 billion a year for 10 years to basically recap just the Navy. That's the current estimate. And my concern is if that $26 billion then goes to 4X or 5X, like the past decade did, we're talking about numbers that are unattainable. And so my concern is, are we in this audit looking at the procurement process and finding the inadequacies in there to recommend changes in the way Congress deals with funding of the Defense Department? There's no capital budget, therefore we deal on a cash flow basis, which nobody else in the world does. And that adds billions and billions and billions of dollars to our procurement process. over and above over-design and design creep. Those are all real, no question about it, and we talked about that. But the one thing that I think as a business guy looking at this, I think the bigger contribution is we don't deal with this in a capital budget format, and the limitations we put on the funding from the federal government create this tremendous opportunity to waste money on the procurement process. Would you respond to that, Mr. Norcross?
So, Senator, the way the information is currently stored, you don't have what you need for a capital budget, but when you look at what the audit standards require, valuing your assets, depreciating, and so forth, that gives you the basis. And so one of the questions for Congress becomes, when you have that type of information, do you want to change the way that you manage the funds? But you wouldn't have that to do today, but over the audit, you'll build up exactly that type of information.